In the gardening Q&A series, today we will look at some tomato growing questions. So let's jump to the first question. Akif writes, my tomatoes have grown more than 8 feet tall and I'm not able to find a tomato cage that big and the branches are falling out. So what do I do? So as you can see here, we've been using these cages. These are the standard cages that are available in most home improvement or garden stores. And they can easily support tomatoes up to 8 or 10 feet. Now the key is to make sure that they're not installed this way that you're seeing here. You need to make sure that the prongs on the bottom are pushed all the way down into the ground. And as you can see in the diagram here, this is where you will need to make sure that the stakes are pushed totally inside the ground, and they're a cheap option to create good tomato cages. If you want to see more details, please do check out our video on tomato cages where we've covered all the types of cages in detail. Our next question comes from Christopher, and he asks whether we prune or indeterminate tomato varieties. Now, I only prune tomatoes that are growing in containers, and I usually only grow determinate varieties in containers. So as you can see here, we are pinching off the suckers of this tomato plant so that the plant grows straight and produces tomatoes as it grows, and it can be tied to a stake. Now for the tomatoes that I grow in raised beds or in the ground, which usually are indeterminate tomatoes, I do not prune a lot, but I do remove the dead leaves and branches as the plant grows. And this is especially true towards the end of the season, where you need access to the tomatoes, so you need to prune a little bit. Now, one thing that's true for both determinate and indeterminate tomatoes, whether growing in containers or raised beds, is to make sure that you prune around the base of the plant and towards the ground where the foliage can touch the water or the ground. By doing this, by keeping the plant clear at the base, you will be able to prevent most tomato diseases. So this is a very important step, determinate or indeterminate. You need to make sure that you prune the base of the plant and keep it very clean. Our next question comes from Mary, and she says, for me it's a no to fertilizer. And this is a very interesting question because I know a lot of you that do not like to use fertilizers. So the first thing that you need to use is to make sure that you use compost, which not only conditions your soil but also provides a lot of nutrients that your plant needs. Now, other than compost or worm castings, you can also use a fertilizer designed for tomatoes and vegetables. And you can either mix it in when you're preparing your container mix, which is the easiest way to do it, or you could just scatter it along the base of the plant and then work it in very well into the soil. So this is an easy way of using fertilizer, and I don't see any reason why you should not use organic fertilizers for your tomatoes, especially because they provide a lot of nutrients to your plants. Our next question comes from Aniket, and he asks whether for growing a healthy plant, why are we taking the life of an animal by using fish, blood, bone of animals in organic fertilizers, and if synthetic fertilizers are an option? And this is a great question. Now, fertilizers are available as organic as well as synthetic or salt-based fertilizers. Organic fertilizers are usually made up of animal products like fish, blood, bone, and feather, like dried blood of cows and pigs and other animals. And synthetic or salt-based fertilizers are made with salts, so they contain nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium in the amounts that the plants need. Now, which one do you want to use is up to you. If you are a vegan or an animal lover and would like to just use a synthetic fertilizer, a salt-based fertilizer, you can go ahead. If you prefer strictly organic farming or organically growing your vegetables, then you can grow your vegetables with an organic fertilizer. So the choice is yours. Our next question comes from Makio Jen, and this person is going to be away for 2 weeks without watering the tomato plant, and the question is, will the tomato plant survive? Well, the answer is no. For 2 weeks, that's a long time. If you're going away for 2 weeks, I highly recommend that you set up a drip irrigation system, an automated watering for your tomato plants that's set to water once a day for about 3 minutes for this 5-gallon size container. or about 2 times a day if your container is large. And this will ensure that your tomato plants get adequate water. Now you can use different kinds of emitters depending on your container size, and I've covered all the emitter types in a separate video. So if you want to know more about setting your own drip irrigation system, I highly recommend that you watch my video on setting up a drip irrigation system for containers. Our next question comes from Abhishek Mishra, and he says that he's not getting a large bounty of tomatoes, and is it the container size? Well, as far as container size goes, you can plant tomatoes in this 15-inch wide, 16-inch long container, which is the ideal container size for one plant, and it holds about 7 gallons of soil. Your other option is to use a square shaped container, which is also about the same capacity, and this works very well for growing a single tomato plant. It also has enough space to add a cage. Now the best option to grow a tomato plant is a whiskey barrel container. And as you can see here, this is almost a 22-inch diameter container and can hold a lot of soil. So if you're using a fast draining mix like the one we described in our video, you should be using a whiskey barrel container to grow your plants. Our next question comes from cruciferous vegetable, and there are 2 questions here. One is about pruning all the stems below the tomatoes and when to do that, and how to get more tomatoes and less foliage. Now to address the first question, yes, you can grow your tomatoes by pruning all the branches around it and as a straight plant, and it will produce a lot of tomatoes. You still need to prune all your leaves and stems around the base of the plant, as I earlier mentioned. And to get more tomatoes and less foliage, you need to feed your tomato plants with a tomato fertilizer when they're blooming. A lot of people make the mistake of adding high nitrogen fertilizers when the plant is in a blooming stage or a fruit producing stage, so they get a lot of stems and leaves but hardly any fruit. Tomatoes do need a high nitrogen fertilizer when starting out, but as they grow and mature and produce flowers and fruit, switch to a low nitrogen fertilizer for your tomatoes. Our next question comes from Jules, and she says that she has a lot of blossoms on her tomato plant but not any fruit. Now, tomato flowers have to be hand pollinated, and if you hand pollinate them, you will get a much better yield. Tomato flowers are pollinated by either wind or by bees. Now, these bumblebees that you see here are the main pollinators for tomatoes and eggplants, and large greenhouses actually breed a lot of these bumblebees so that they can get a very high fruit production. And the bumblebee population is steadily decreasing, and that is one reason why you might see less fruit production. So make sure you hand pollinate all your tomatoes and eggplants. And some of our YouTube viewers have posted great results by hand pollinating their tomato plants, so this method definitely does work. Our next question comes from Angel Heart, and the question is about refilling containers with chicken manure once the season is completed. And yes, you can use any kind of manure. Here is steer manure. This is composted steer manure that you can see here. And you can also use chicken manure, which is a great amendment to your container soil. So I usually mix up a lot of compost in the container mix after I remove the container mix from the previous season. And as you can see here, we're mixing up our compost very well. And if you're using this high draining, high porosity mix, I'm also mixing in some compost, some peat moss, and some wood chips. But yes, you can always add a lot of compost, worm castings, and manure when refilling your containers. Our next question comes from Wanda Lucha, and this question is about blight. And she cannot grow tomatoes without blight. Now, blight is a fungal disease, so the first thing you want to do is try to grow varieties which are blight resistant. For example, this Juliet tomato, which is very blight resistant. And to prevent your plant from getting most fungal diseases, you can use aspirin. Just take 2 tablets, mix it with water, and then water it. And aspirin is completely organic and it's good for you and your plants. And aspirin is not completely soluble in water, so if you want, you can just crush the aspirin tablets and put them around your plant, and they will be taken up eventually by the plants, and it helps the plant build resistance to a lot of fungal diseases. So this is a good way to stop fungal diseases like blight on your plants by just watering them with an aspirin solution. or adding crushed aspirin at the ground at the base of the plant. So that was our Q&A session for growing tomatoes. If you have any more questions, drop them in the comments below. If you liked our video, do give us a thumbs up. And if you like to see more gardening Q&A series, do let us know. And we'll see you again soon. Until then, goodbye.